In this episode, we take the planning work from the previous topic and tighten it into something that can actually be executed without collapsing under its own ambition. Scoping is where you turn good intentions into realistic boundaries. And the reason this matters is simple. An assessment that tries to look at everything often ends up proving almost nothing. When you scope assets, methods, and level of effort, you are deciding what you will look at, how you will look at it, and how deep you will go before you run out of time, access, patience, or all three. Beginners sometimes think scoping is about limiting work to make life easier, but the healthier way to see it is that scoping is about preserving credibility. A realistic assessment is one where the results can be defended, repeated, and acted on because the work was matched to the time and resources available. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at CGRC.Me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The first piece is scoping assets, and an asset in this context is anything you need to consider to make a trustworthy statement about the system or process being assessed. Assets can be obvious, like servers, endpoints, applications, databases, and network segments, but they can also be less tangible, like data flows, identities, third-party services, and business processes that shape how the system operates. A common misunderstanding is to treat the asset list like an inventory exercise, where you list every item you can find and call it scope. In an assessment, the asset scope needs to be connected to the objective, meaning you focus on assets that materially affect the requirements you are assessing. If the requirement is about access control, assets that store sensitive data and assets that manage identities are probably more important than a marketing website with no user accounts. Asset scoping is also about boundary clarity, because if no one agrees where the system starts and ends, you cannot agree what evidence is relevant. Asset scope becomes more practical when you classify assets by their role and criticality rather than by their brand names or technical details. Think in terms of what the asset does for the system, such as authenticating users, storing regulated data, processing transactions, or providing administrative access. This helps you avoid a trap where the assessment gets dragged into low-impact components just because they are easy to see, while missing high-impact components that are less visible. Another beginner trap is confusing ownership with relevance, where you exclude a critical dependency because it is owned by another team or a vendor. In real environments, dependencies are part of reality, so scoping has to account for them even if you cannot examine them at the same depth. When a critical dependency cannot be fully assessed, you document the limitation and decide how you will handle the risk, rather than pretending the dependency does not exist. Once you have a sensible asset scope, you move into scoping methods, which is where you choose the approaches you will use to gather and evaluate evidence. Methods can include interviews, document examination, observation, sampling, and technical testing, but you do not have to use every method for every control. The method choice should match the type of claim you are trying to validate. If you are assessing whether a policy exists and is approved, examining the policy and approval records is appropriate. If you are assessing whether accounts are reviewed regularly, you might examine review artifacts and also interview the reviewers to understand the process. If you are assessing whether a technical control operates, like logging or encryption, you may need to observe configurations or review system outputs as evidence. The method is not about what is interesting. It is about what is persuasive. Method scoping is also about choosing what not to do, which can feel uncomfortable for new assessors because they worry they will miss something. A realistic plan accepts that no assessment has infinite depth, so you prioritize methods that provide strong evidence for the most important requirements. You also consider the environment's tolerance for disruption, because some methods are more intrusive than others. For example, deep technical testing might require access and time windows that are not available, while interviews and document review might be more feasible but could be weaker if documentation is poor. The skill is not picking the fanciest method. The skill is picking the method that yields the best evidence within constraints. A mature assessment plan often uses multiple methods for high-risk areas and lighter methods for lower-risk areas, and it explains that logic plainly. Now we get to level of effort, which is one of the most important realism controls in assessment planning. Level of effort is the amount of work that will be performed, usually expressed in time and depth, and it includes how many assets you will touch, how many people you will interview, how many samples you will review, and how much testing you will perform. Beginners sometimes treat level of effort like a guess, but it can be estimated with simple reasoning. If you have 10 controls to assess and each one requires a document review, at least one interview, and evidence validation, you can estimate the minimum time required based on those activities. If the schedule says you have 3 days, but the activity estimate says you need 10, the plan is not realistic, and realism has to win. Level of effort is where you make the hard choice between narrowing scope, increasing resources, or accepting a lower confidence result. Sampling is a key tool for managing level of effort, and it is also a common area of confusion for beginners. Sampling means you examine a subset of items, like a selection of user accounts, a set of change tickets, or a slice of log records, and you use that subset to make a statement about the broader population. Sampling helps you avoid the impossible task of reviewing everything, but it requires thought, because a bad sample can create false confidence. A realistic assessment plan will define what populations exist, what sample sizes are appropriate for the risk, and what sampling method makes sense. You might use random sampling to reduce bias, or judgmental sampling to focus on higher-risk categories, and sometimes you combine them. The important thing is to document how the sample was chosen and why, because that documentation supports defensibility. Sampling is not a shortcut. It is a disciplined way to manage effort while preserving evidence quality. Another realism skill is understanding control coverage versus control depth, because these are two different levers you can adjust. Coverage is how many controls or requirements you assess, and depth is how thoroughly you assess each one. If you try to maximize both, you will usually fail unless you have a very large team and a long schedule. A realistic assessment often has to choose, for example, deep assessment of critical controls and lighter assessment of supporting controls, or broader coverage with limited depth when the objective is to get a baseline picture. This is where the assessment objective matters again, because the objective tells you what decision the assessment supports. If the decision is high stakes, like an authorization or a major compliance attestation, depth becomes more important. If the decision is about prioritizing improvements, broader coverage might be more useful, as long as you clearly state the limits of confidence. Realism means aligning these choices with purpose and being honest about what the results can support. Constraints and dependencies also shape realism, and they deserve explicit attention in scoping. Constraints might include limited access, restricted testing, short timelines, or limited availability of key personnel. Dependencies might include third-party services, shared infrastructure, or upstream processes like identity management that are outside the immediate system boundary. A realistic assessment plan does not pretend constraints do not exist, and it does not magically assume dependencies will be transparent. Instead, it designs around them by selecting methods that still produce meaningful evidence, or by scoping the assessment to what can be credibly assessed while documenting what cannot. This is also where you decide what evidence is acceptable when direct evidence is not possible, such as relying on independent audit reports for a vendor service, or using contractual assurance artifacts. The key is to avoid the two extremes of either ignoring constraints or letting constraints excuse everything. Realism is a balancing act, not a surrender. It helps to think about realism in terms of evidence strength, because some forms of evidence carry more weight than others. A written policy can show intent, but it does not prove behavior. An interview can explain how something works, but it can be biased or incomplete. A system-generated record can be strong evidence of operation, but it can be misunderstood if you do not know what it really represents. A realistic assessment plan aims to gather enough strong evidence to support the conclusions being made, especially for high-risk requirements. That might mean using multiple evidence types for the same requirement, like pairing documentation with records and interviews. If the plan relies heavily on weaker evidence, like informal statements, it should either increase effort to find stronger proof or lower the confidence of conclusions accordingly. Realism means understanding that evidence strength and effort are connected, and you cannot demand high confidence without paying the cost in time and access. A practical way to keep scoping realistic is to create a clear trace between objectives, assets, methods, and effort, even if you do not present it as a formal matrix. You should be able to explain, in plain language, why each major asset group is included, what methods will be used for that group, and how much effort those methods will take. If you cannot explain that trace, there is a good chance the scope is inflated or unfocused. This trace also supports communication with stakeholders, because stakeholders will ask questions like, why are we looking at this system? Why do you need that access? And why is this taking so long? When your scope is realistic, the answers are straightforward and tied to objectives rather than personal preference. It also helps reduce friction because people cooperate more when they understand the logic behind the requests. A scope that feels arbitrary invites resistance. Realistic scoping also includes planning for change during the assessment, because environments are not static. Systems get patched, accounts change, tickets are opened and closed, and documentation gets updated, sometimes because of the assessment itself. A realistic plan defines a time window for evidence, such as a recent period that represents normal operations, and it makes decisions about how to handle changes discovered midstream. If a control is being implemented during the assessment, you may need to decide whether the assessment will evaluate it as fully operating or as in progress. If a critical issue is discovered, you may need to adjust priorities to gather enough evidence to understand it, without derailing the entire schedule. Realism means building in some buffer for the unexpected and having a clear process for scope adjustments. The goal is not perfection. The goal is a stable process that can absorb reality without losing integrity. One more misconception worth clearing up is the belief that scoping down automatically reduces value. Sometimes scoping down increases value because it lets you concentrate on what matters most and produce clearer, more defensible findings. A tightly scoped assessment can produce strong conclusions about high-risk areas, which is often more useful than broad, shallow conclusions that no one trusts. The key is to be transparent, because stakeholders may hear narrower scope and assume corners are being cut. If you explain that the scope is focused to preserve rigor and align with objectives, and that lower priority areas can be assessed later, you often get better stakeholder support. This transparency also protects the assessment team because it prevents unrealistic expectations that lead to criticism later. A realistic scope is not an excuse. It is a deliberate decision that balances risk, resources, and the need for credible evidence. When you put all of these pieces together, you start to see scoping as a professional judgment skill rather than a paperwork step. You are learning to decide what assets matter most to the assessment objective, what methods will produce persuasive evidence for those assets, and what level of effort is required to do the work with integrity. You are also learning to manage constraints and dependencies without letting them undermine defensibility. Most importantly, you are learning to communicate these decisions clearly so stakeholders understand what the assessment will accomplish and what limits exist. That combination of focus, realism, and transparency is what turns an assessment into something that supports governance decisions instead of generating confusion. With realistic scoping, the assessment becomes an organized effort that can actually finish, and the results become something people can trust and act on.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.